CSS Flexbox, everything that you need to know. So this is going to be video 1 of a series that I'm going to do on Flexbox, in which I kind of break it down into different parts, in which we explain each part throughout the series. So today, I'm going to give you a background and some basic terminology of CSS Flexbox. And then following this, we're going to get into what a Flex container is and different properties of a Flex container. And then following videos are going to hit on what Flex children are and different properties of those children. And then we're going to get into some overviews and examples of kind of putting it all together. Okay. So today we're going to go into background and just like basic terminology of CSS Flexbox. And to do this, we're going to use a great resource for CSS Flexbox and CSS in general, which is CSS Tricks. And this was written by Chris Hoyer. He keeps it nice and updated. It was originally written in 2013, but he updated it just a couple months ago here, at least at the time that I'm recording this. So we're going to kind of use this article to kind of supplement our learning here. So first off, CSS Flexbox, or the Flexbox layout, is a module that aims to provide a more efficient way to lay out, align, and distribute space among items in a container, even when their size is unknown or their size is dynamic, hence the word flex. The main idea behind Flexbox layout is to give the container ability to alter its items' width and height to best fill the available space. A Flex container expands items to fill available space or shrinks them to prevent overflow. Most importantly, the Flexbox layout is direction agnostic, as opposed to some regular layouts. While those work well for pages, they lack flexibility, no pun intended, to support large or complex applications. So overall, Flexbox is a way to lay things out on your web page, and it allows for a much more dynamic layout, in which a Flexbox layout is much more likely to be responsive to changing sizes of a web page. So when you change things to responsive mode, I think that Flexbox is going to handle that much better than some other ways that people would use to lay out things on the page. And one reason for that are because it's direction agnostic, to where you can lay things out vertically instead of horizontally. And that can be really helpful when creating a responsive layout. And you can also have things kind of shrink or grow to fill the available space, as it kind of mentions here in this paragraph. So I totally agree that it's a more efficient way to lay out and align and distribute items across your web page and make things much more dynamic. So definitely something that you need to know. And I know there's CSS Grid, but I don't view those as like necessarily two things that compete with each other. Like, you can definitely use Grid and Flexbox together. And I think there's better use cases for Flexbox compared to Grid and vice versa. All right. So now let's get into some kind of basic terminology here. So right here, it kind of gets into how Flexbox has terminology that relates to a container and items, in which when you create your Flexbox, you're going to set your display to Flexbox on an overall container. And then any elements within that container, you can kind of lay those elements out. So that container is going to be referred to as a Flex container. And those elements within your overall container are going to be considered Flex items. Or you might also hear this referred to as that container as your kind of Flex parent or the parent element. And then those Flex items, the elements within your container, as your children elements. And when using Flexbox, you'll set some properties for your Flex container, and you'll also be able to set some properties for your Flex items or your Flex children. But I'll cover those individually in separate videos of this series. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see that this very outside border here, this would be considered your Flex container. And then within it here, you have two elements, and these would both be considered Flex items. So this element number 1 here and this element number 2, these would be Flex items. And you could set separate properties for this Flex container, as well as separate properties for this Flex items to change the behavior of how this overall Flexbox works. And then some kind of terminology that it has in here is, for one, we have the main axis of the Flexbox. The main axis of a Flex container is the primary axis along which Flex items are laid out. Beware, it is not necessarily horizontal. It depends on the flex direction property that you set, which we will get to in a little bit. So the main axis here, it's going to be the primary axis in which these items are laid out. So these items are laid out horizontally here. So the main axis is going to go from left to right horizontally across your page throughout your parent container. Okay. Now, with that, we also have the cross axis, and this axis is perpendicular to the main axis. Its direction also depends on which way the items are laid out. So since these items are laid out from left to right here horizontally and not vertically, the cross axis is going to be from top to bottom. And you can see it here. It goes perpendicular to your main axis. Now, if these items were stacked vertically, so you had item 1 here, and let's say item 2 is below it here, then the main axis would be from top to bottom. It would go in the direction that you lay out these elements, and the cross axis would still run perpendicular. So then it would switch to being horizontal. That can be a little bit tricky, but just remember that the main axis always goes in the direction that you lay out your elements, either horizontal or vertical. And then the cross axis, it just runs perpendicular to it. It runs across the main axis, hence cross axis. Okay. And then we have the main start and main end. So the flex items are placed within the container starting from the main start and going to the main end. So this is just like the start and end of your flex box. So you can see it labeled here. This is your main start and this is your main end. And similarly, it is kind of the start and end of your main axis. If these were stacked vertically, your main start and main end would also be stacked kind of vertically, top and bottom of your container. But since they're stacked horizontally here, your main start and main end go right along the main axis to the start and end of your main axis. And very similar thing with cross end and cross start. Flex lines are filled with items and placed into the container starting from the cross start of the flex container and going toward the crossed end side. So it just is the start and end of your cross axis, which runs perpendicular to your main axis. And then you also have your main size. This is the flex items' width or height. Whichever is the main dimension is the item's main size. The flex items' main size property is either the width or height property, whichever is in the main dimension. So here, the main size is going to be the width of this container here, as you can see it labeled right there. And then the cross size is going to be the opposite. It's going to be the size of kind of the space that the cross axis takes up, so to speak. The cross start and cross end, well, between those are going to be your cross size. Okay. So those are just some kind of basic terminology on Flexbox. And like I kind of said earlier, Flexbox is a way to lay elements out on your webpage in a more kind of a responsive way. And you have different terminology that goes along with it, in which you have a Flex container, and then you have your Flex items within it, and you can set different properties on your Flex container, as well as your Flex items to lay these elements out. And you don't have to have all these memorized, but I would say the main ones that you'll need to know is knowing like which way your main axis is going, as well as your cross axis, as that will kind of relate to some of the properties that you set on these elements. All right. So that is some basic terminology of Flexbox. In my next video, I'm going to get into the Flex container and different properties that you set on the Flex container, how to make it a Flex container. So make sure that you're stay tuned for that.